Most of us anglers know that bass can be here one day and gone the next, but a recent study showed that this one bass swam over 314 miles over the course of a 2-year study. In today's video, I got on the biologist who studied this fish as well as several others, including a 10-pound Lake Erie smallmouth. I believe that his findings will help us as anglers, so stay tuned. It's gonna be a good one. Welcome back to the Bass Juice podcast here with CJ Schaefer. How you going? How's it going, CJ?
It's going good, dude. I'm excited. This is going to be a great podcast. We've got Zach Slagle from the ODNR up at Lake Erie, and we're going to pick his brain about the kind of the movement and the biology of the smallmouth bass and largemouth, but I think Erie is most known for smallmouth bass.
Yeah.
So super excited to hear what he's got to say.
Zach, you have written 2 different papers now, and I think you've done you maybe even done more than that. I know of the 2 that you have done here kind of in the last 3 or 4 years about smallmouth on Lake Erie. And I just wanted for our audience to just have you kind of overview some of those studies and those papers and just kind of go over, even some of the findings that you have had.
So first off, thanks for having me on. Appreciate it. So back in 2018, we tagged a total of 23 smallmouth in the Ohio Bass Federation semifinal that was held out of Sandusky, Ohio. So it's on Lake Erie, but in Sandusky Bay, which is a pretty big bay on Lake Erie. And when I say tagging, we're putting external tags that you can see on them, but we're also surgically implanting these transmitters into them that emit ultrasonic sounds that are unique to that tag. Mm-hmm. And then we also have receivers that look like the size of a 2-liter Coke bottle or something like that, and they just listen for those tags. So if we can put those receivers out on the bottom of the bay or the lake, they can listen for these tags, and then if we put enough receivers out, we can actually see where these fish swim. So the original project was a tournament dispersal project. So looking at when a tournament is held at one weigh-in location, it's very typical for anglers to go out, catch fish, and then bring them back to that site, weigh them in, and then they just get released right there. And this is not the first time this kind of study has been done. There's been a fair amount of studies looking at tournament dispersal, and we're concerned about this potentially as a management agency, as the Ohio Division of Wildlife. If those fish can actually move away from the tournament release site, which you would think that they would, but if they're concentrated there, then they might be subject to higher fishing pressure, greater fishing mortality, that kind of thing, or suboptimal habitat. And then we also wanted to see if they could make it back out into the main lake. The main lake from Sandusky is about a 7-mile shot, and then it's even further to make it out into their capture habitats out of the Bass Islands and Kelly's Island and that kind of thing. And previous tournament studies had shown that they're kind of all over the place. Sometimes these fish are dispersing from the release site very rapidly within a few days, and sometimes they're sitting there for a month or more within a third of a mile of the release site. We actually got capture locations from the anglers. The anglers are very generous in sharing approximate places where they caught fish. Yeah. And we saw that they were moved an average of 15 miles and up to 30 miles from their capture sites to Sandusky Bay. And then after the fish were released, we tracked a total of 19 of them. Of those 19, they all ended up dispersing from the immediate area of Shelby Street boat ramp where they were released. And that took an average of 2 weeks or so. So they hung out around the boat ramp for a little while. Okay. And then we also looked at their movement within the bay or out to the main lake. And we found that about 60% of the fish made it back into the main lake. And that took an average of 21 days or 3 weeks. Okay. So that was an encouraging sign. Some of these fish are at least able to make it back out in the main lake. But after 2 months, we saw that 40% of those fish had not made it back out there. They were either milling around in the bay or they had kind of taken off in a direction that wasn't taking them towards the main lake.
So about 40%, you said, just basically stayed in Erie or in the bay itself.
Yes. As far as, us managing the fishery that's a little bit concerning potentially, because if those fish can't make it back out to their capture locations in the Bass Islands, then we might be functionally harvesting them. Even though we're doing catch and release, and the tournament guys are taking care of the fish as best they can. If those fish can't make it back there, then if you're looking at the Bass Island population, those fish aren't back there anymore.
So the other question with that 40%, I know that you guys don't have like a billion of the, what do you call them, the things that you actually put on the bottom of the lake?
The receivers,
The
yeah.
receivers.
Acoustic
So
receivers.
you don't have a ton, could some of those fish have slipped like through the cracks of the receivers, or did you pretty much have it where like you knew if they were going to be outside of the bay or inside of the bay?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the 2-month timeline was for our, we deployed a grid of these receivers temporarily for 2 months.
Mm-hmm.
So that's when we had our best data. But out in the main lake itself, there is an existing an acoustic receiver array that's maintained. So there's an international partnership called GLaDOS. It's the Great Lakes Acoustic Telemetry Observation System. Mm-hmm. And they maintain a network of these receivers that's, there's probably 400 receivers live in Lake Erie right now. And all across the Great Lakes, too. There's more in the Great Lakes. But so the nice thing about this is that I can tag fish and release them, and then if they go swimming out in the main lake, we can actually see their movement.
Interesting. Do you have any data or information as to why the fish are staying in the bay? Are they able to know, okay, I could swim back out to my catch site, but the bay can sustain my life, so I'm just going to stick around here?
So we don't know exactly why. This tournament took place in September, so it's some of the hottest water temperatures that we see in Lake Erie. So that's a potential issue, that with higher water temperatures, lower dissolved oxygen, more stress on the fish. So that could play a factor. And also, we don't know how these fish are able to navigate like that. That it could be, there's some suggestion that they navigate via sight. I don't know that I believe that, but if that were the case, Sandusky Bay is very turbid, especially in September where we have algae blooms and stuff like that. So maybe they just can't find their way. But I can only really speculate. And there are, going back to the previous question too, there are even though we have hundreds of receivers out in the lake and in the bay, there's still spaces where they can fit through. The range on these things is probably, if we have calm conditions, it's probably about a mile. And in the main lake, the grid is spaced out every 10 miles or so. So there's definitely, there's spaces where these fish can disappear. And we actually saw, for the 23 that we initially tagged, we had 2 that we believe were mortalities within the first week or so. And then we had another 2 that just kind of disappeared. We saw them at Shelby Street at the receiver that was right there at the release site. And then they disappeared, not to be seen again in 3 years of tracking or something like that. The tag should have been good for 3 years.
Okay.
So those we kind of just take out of the analysis and say we don't know what happened to them.
Because there could be a number of things. I mean, if they
they could have been harvested.
Well, I was about to ask you, if they were harvested, would you? I guess you wouldn't. You wouldn't. It's not like you have receivers out on on the land, so you wouldn't have seen that go away.
Yeah. And they wouldn't even work on the land because the sound transfers through water so much better than it does through air that the range on those tags is not. It's not. I mean, it's probably a couple of feet if it's out of the water. We had external tags like loop tags that are orange. They have our phone number on it, and they each have a unique identifier on them. So we did one of those mortalities was actually called in. Someone found the tag at the boat ramp, just washed up on shore. So if it's harvested, hopefully someone can see that tag and call us, but that doesn't mean that they necessarily do. Yeah. There's definitely the possibility where someone just saw it, kept the fish, and just said, "Oh, I'm not calling the DNR." Why would I do that?
The interesting thing about some of those statistics that you gave me is that I've done several studies on the channel, and one that they did on Champlain was kind of similar in some of the percentages. I believe that Because they, Lake Champlain is a massive lake as well, and they brought them all back to one bay there as well. And they saw that, I think over the course of a year, I think only 55% of them had left that bay. So a little over half, which, like what you just said, over that 3-month period, 40% either stayed in the bay or, like we said, potentially maybe was harvested. So it's interesting to see how, even though they're different fisheries, vastly different, how some of those percentages are the same, and how also there's so many tournaments across the nation where you see guys that are winning tournaments right by the boat ramp. Yep. And I know this is tournament talk, but like that, I think, is a big part of it, is that, if you constantly have tournaments that are going out of the same ramp, there's going to be a population of bass that are in that area, because once they get, put back right there, they're going to stay. They're going to stay. There's a big portion of the bass that are just going to stay right there.
Yeah, close to half of them.
Yeah.
It's interesting. They're basically restocking that area.
Yeah.
Over and over.
Yeah. So a couple of the findings, I know that I think I saw in the one study that these fish after the tournament, so we're kind of getting into maybe more or less the second paper that you wrote, these fish over the course of 2 years would basically swim, like on average, somewhere around, I think it was 100 kilometers, which is equivalent to like 60, 70 miles over the course of that couple of years. Is that correct?
Yeah, and that's so part of the reason, that initial study was partially to look at tournament dispersal, but also we were hoping that this would act as sort of a pilot study, like initial work to get more tagging out there, and the initial work being, can the fish that we tag here in Sandusky be tracked out on the main lake using just the existing acoustic array. So we did end up seeing, so the tags are good for about 3 years or so. We ended up tracking a total of 8 of the original 23 fish out on the main lake array. And those fish ended up making some pretty big movements. Yeah, so we saw, annual movements of each year around 60 or 70 miles, like you're saying, and total movements over the course of 2 years of up to, 200 plus miles.
Wow.
Which is quite a bit further than we expected to see.
Yeah. I noticed, I think you said that one fish, I was reading in the study, had gone 505 kilometers, which is 314 miles over 2 years. 314 miles. That's nuts to me.
It's insane, and I wonder what the fish is thinking. Why is it moving that far? Is it because it's just following bait? Is it more of a pelagic fish, more of an open water? Is it more of a bottom fish that feeds on gobies, crawfish? It's so interesting.
Yeah, it is, and it definitely. I think that bass fishermen know how much smallmouth move, but when you put it into that terms, like miles and miles, like that's just crazy. No wonder you can find them one day of a tournament, show up the next day,
they're gone.
Yep. I know that, especially the ones that are out in the main basin of Lake Erie, because those transmitters, the receivers, I guess, because the receivers are so far apart, were you able to tell, like, were there certain paths that any of these fish followed? Would they follow a ridge line? Were you able to see that? Or are you able to just say, hey, they just went in this general direction? They swam over 50 foot of water or 30 foot or whatever?
We don't have real fine scale information like that, like a specific ridge or something, but I can tell you that these fish tended to stay closer to like rocky habitat. So like, coming out of the bay, a lot of these fish went towards the Bass Islands or Kelly's Island, where there's some reefs, there's a lot of rocky, hard substrate, and they seem to either hang out in the island area or go up into Ontario waters, up towards Pelee Island, where there's still the same kind of rocky substrate. They seem to avoid, the expanses of like clay and sand substrate that we have in a lot of the central basin. So they'd either be, kind of hugging the islands, going in between islands, or staying closer to the shoreline, like within 10 miles of the shoreline. There was only one fish that I can think of that went kind of out of that pattern and kind of just traveled out into, as far as I know, there's not a whole lot out there towards Point Pelee. And we did see some kind of like, there's a little bit of suggestion of seasonal movement too.
Okay.
So a few of these fish moved into Ontario waters north of the Bass Islands in the wintertime. And those waters are a bit deeper and maybe a little bit protected from storms. And then we saw in the so that was around December is when we had one of our highest movement times. And then come April and May, when they're making their spawning movements, that's when they were coming back down into U.S. waters, going back to the Bass Islands, or returning to probably where they're spawning.
That's incredible. Is it? I'm guessing there's 10, 20, 30 miles between those movements. Is that from Ontario down to the Bass Islands? Just for, hey, I'm moving north for the winter, I'm coming south to spawn, and that's all movement in between there.
This video is brought to you by the Deep Dive app. This is an app that you can download on your phone that helps you to find bass on your local bodies of water a lot quicker. Once you download this app, you can actually select the lake that you are fishing, and then you can input data like water temperature, water clarity, whether you are fishing around vegetation, or if you are fishing in a windy or protected area. Once you input all this information, the app will actually spit out lures, techniques, and areas that you can go on your local body of water to catch bass. This app is backed by hundreds of different tournament results from across the nation and can be extremely accurate. So if you guys would like to help support the Bass Fishing HQ channel and allow me to bring more videos like this to you, hit that link down below and download the Deep Dive app today. One thing that I heard you say is that you didn't kind of really believe that the fish more or less used their sight as they moved, or maybe not. It's maybe not the biggest factor. What do you think kind of are some of those big factors that kind of help them get back to an area or find a new area?
Yeah, so I mean, I think I'll be the first one to tell you. You kind of referenced it earlier. Like, I will tell you what I don't know, because there's plenty that we don't know.
Yeah.
And I don't know for sure how they navigate for sure. Like, there's a few papers in the literature, a few studies in the scientific literature that have suggested that, maybe they use sight to navigate. Because, like in that one study that you referenced, the fish tended to stick to the shorelines and did not want to go over deep open water. But to me, that doesn't hold as much water with a big lake like Lake Erie, because for one, when a fish is born, like, it doesn't travel that far. Initially when it's small, it can't go that far. Yeah. So I don't know how it would get familiar with all these landmarks supposedly. Yeah. And then it's also, we have pretty low water clarity. We have algae bloom problems in the summertime. So it's hard for a fish. You would think it would be hard to fish for a fish to navigate when it can only see 5 feet in front of its face. Yeah. So I'm not sure exactly what drives them to migrate here in Lake Erie, but I can tell you from other studies, there's a couple of interesting results. There are 2 different tournament dispersal studies that took place in estuaries. So one was in northern Chesapeake Bay, and one was in Albemarle Sound in North Carolina. And those fish tended to disperse from their release sites very quickly, like within 5 days. They were leaving the release site, and then they saw a fairly high number of those fish return to their capture sites. Within the year of the studies, you're talking about like 20% to 33% of the fish were making it back to capture sites, and sometimes traveling over 10 miles to get there. Wow. So that got me thinking about it. And then also there's another study that some researchers in Carleton University in Ontario did, where they wanted to look at how do smallmouth navigate back to their nest sites. If you catch them and you move them a little bit, what senses are they using to find that? So they tested out. They did some. It's all humane as far as I understood, but they temporarily blinded fish. They like glued a magnet to their head, and then they put like Vaseline in their nostrils
Mm-hmm.
to test whether they were navigating via sight, via smell, or via magnetic fields.
Mm-hmm.
And what they found was that when they blinded their sense of smell, when the bass couldn't smell, it took a significantly longer time for it to navigate back to its nest site.
Mm.
So those two pieces of information have me thinking, like, in the estuaries, you have a bunch of rivers coming in that have unique chemical signatures. So and so a bass could probably smell the difference between different rivers because they have different geologies, they have different minerals in the water. So that could help those fish navigate back, and then we could also see, if they're using sense of smell to navigate back to their nest sites, maybe that's helping them to navigate in other situations.
Mm.
So in Lake Erie, that it makes sense that they wouldn't, for example, go up the Sandusky River, which we didn't see any of our fish do because that's not home to them. It seemed like they navigated back to the main lake, and some of them potentially back to their capture sites, maybe via that. But that's just my kind of like harebrained theory from reading a bunch of journal articles.
Yeah. No, and that makes perfect sense. I actually did a video on that study you were talking about, with using their sense to navigate back to nest, and it makes sense, like you're saying, with estuaries. Like if there's a different creek or river that they kind of call home coming in, it is going to have those different, like you said, chemicals or even I guess maybe proteins or whatever that they can smell, and that they can navigate to. So that's just super interesting to me.
I think have there been any studies on do fish return to their nesting site annually?
Yes. Nesting sites, yes, for sure. There's a couple of papers that have looked at that, and they do tend to return, it's like 90 or 95% of fish return to the same sites to nest every year.
Wow.
Or, same site meaning like within 80 meters of its previous site.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
So I wonder if the fish's annual movements, whether it's moving north to Ontario for winter, come back down south for spawn, circle around the Bass Islands, go up to Pelee, does the fish do that every single year? Or are there outside factors like, is it following between the spawn and winter? Is it following bait fish around? And then it's eventually going to make its way back to its wintering hole, back to its spawning site, and then do the whole cycle again. It just doesn't know where it's going to go in between those two seasons.
Yeah. Huh. That's interesting. Were you able to see that fish that swam 300 miles? Did it return back to like its general area or where it spawned the year prior, or were you able to see it at least come back?
It didn't see that was probably the most confusing fish because I don't understand its movements. It went back out to the Bass Islands, which is where a lot of the fish were caught. We can't exactly match up capture locations to individual fish because of essentially the tournament weigh-in was too fast, and we just needed a tag fish, and we got mixed up. But so that long distance moving fish went to the Bass Islands, then it went all the way over to Cleveland area, and then from Cleveland it overwintered near Cleveland, and then traveled like half of the Ohio shoreline all the way over to Michigan waters, north of Toledo. And it had not been up there that we had seen. So that's one that just kind of blows my mind. Like, I'm not sure. I don't understand why it was doing what it was doing. And none of the other fish that we saw were doing that. They were making like a little bit more regular, like, we'll go into Ontario waters for the winter, come back to the Bass Islands in the summertime, and not make these huge movements. That
kind of correlates with some of those other studies that I've done, that it's not that bass have personalities, but they just have different behaviors, where like some, for instance, down south in Toledo Bend, there'd be some that they stayed within like 100-yard section of the lake the entire year. And then others would constantly travel. Like they were out of the creek arm that they were caught in right away, and they didn't see them for like a year, and then they'd come back. So it's just interesting how, we talk about fishing a lot, how we think the bass are all doing kind of the same thing. Like, oh, the bass are moving out to here, or the bass are coming in to here, where really each fish is a little bit different. And it's like, that's also why when we're picking out our lures and whatnot, why sometimes you catch them on this lure and sometimes it's a different lure, So it's just interesting to me, that whole, that.
I think you're right, though. They all have their own personalities and maybe preferences, and maybe this smallmouth that traveled 300 miles hugging the shorelines, maybe he just prefers to stay in that shallower water, eat gobies, crawfish, don't even worry about finding bait fish out roaming in open water.
So one question I did have is, because you have read so many papers and just even been a part of so many studies, is there anything that really, you talked about a few, but is there anything else that you have seen bass related that you just kind of were blown away by or thought was really, really interesting?
So there's two different studies that I was a part of in Florida. I did my master's at the University of Florida. So I was involved in a lot of different fun bass studies there. One was that we did what we called the Bass Learning Project, where we had this relatively small lake. It was about 10 acres. It didn't have any angling pressure on it. It's on private property, and so there's no angling pressure. So what we did is we did the structured angling study where yes, I got paid to go fishing, which is not a common practice, but
awesome.
For this particular study I did, and we just had 2 anglers per day, but we put a ton of fishing effort into this lake. So it was 36 hours of effort every week for 6 weeks.
Wow.
And we're only using 2 lures. We're using chrome rattle trap, so a real obnoxious bait. And then we're also using green pumpkin Senko, weightless Senko. So a little bit more subtle, more passive. And what we found is that in that first week, we caught the hell out of them. Fish, we caught 2 bass per hour or something like that on both of the lures. But as the weeks progressed, they very quickly learned that the chrome rattle trap was not good to bite. So within 2 weeks or something like that, we were catching maybe 1 fish a day, 1 fish in 6 hours on the rattle trap. Whereas the Senko, they learned that one a lot slower. We did see a decline in the catch rate for the Senkos, but it was much more gradual. And even by the end of the study, by the end of 6 weeks, it was a chore to be fishing the rattle trap. When it was your hour to fish the rattle trap, it was just a pain because you knew you weren't going to catch fish, and you'd be slinging that thing and reeling it in, slinging it and reeling it. Whereas the Senko, you could actually have some hope that you were going to catch a fish.
Huh. That's super interesting. it makes sense.
It makes sense. It's, pressure. When they talk about tournament pressure, fishing pressure on a body of water, that's it.
Yeah. Now, do you think that the bass, do you know if it's do they get, I don't know if you can actually determine this, but maybe theorize whether it was the sight, the look of the bait that they saw, or maybe it was the vibration, or maybe it's just everything in general. But is there anything that you can kind of more or less theorize about?
I guess my theory has been that the sound, for one, is a big difference between those 2 baits. So maybe just the sound of the rattle trap going is a trigger for them to know that they're going to get caught. But it could also be that they're learning that, the forage that looks like this little fish is something that will cause me pain. Whereas the Senko kind of, that can imitate a bunch of different things. And depending on how you're working it, it might look like a fish, but it also might look like a bug in the water or a crayfish or something like that. So it might just be a combination of those two, where the sound and just the appearance of the bait is not as specific for the Senko as it is for a rattle trap.
Interesting. And conditionally, were you able to see if it was overcast day, bright sunny day? Did you take conditions into consideration during this?
We took notes on the weather, but we did not look at specific conditions, no. So we could have factored that in, but overall it seemed like the biggest predictive factor is how much effort had been put into that lake, within the last 6 weeks or so.
So did you say that there was a second study that you were a part of as well that was interesting?
So we did, I did my master's project looking at Florida largemouth bass nesting success, or Florida bass nesting success. So we would actually go and snorkel that pond and a few other ponds twice a week in the springtime, and we'd actually find the bass nests and then track them and look at how successful they are. And that's been done in a couple different places. It's actually been done on Lake Erie and up north in Canada. And probably the most interesting finding from that was that we found that the fish down south and these Florida bass were they were not as tenacious in defending their nests. Like they would often, you would see the male bass on the nest as you were snorkeling towards the nest, and then he would just swim off. And you'd have to go look at where he was, and then you'd find the nest there. And then we'd also find some nests that had eggs on them, and that would end up being successful. Success in this case means that they go from eggs to swim up fry ball, where they're just a little cloud of fry. We found some nests that we never saw a male on any of the visits. We'd be visiting these nests, we'd mark them, and then we'd revisit them every time until the nest either made it to the swim up fry ball stage, or the was abandoned. The eggs would get they get this like mold or fungus on them. So sometimes we wouldn't even see a male fish guarding that nest. Whereas if you look at the studies up north, they never see males not on the nest. If the male has left the nest, typically they're considering that nest to have failed already, even if it has active eggs on it, because their males, like up north, the males are much more tenacious in defending the nest. So they'll actually attack you if you're scuba or if you're snorkeling with them. They'll come and like peck you in the face and stuff like that. They want you away from their nests.
Wow.
Down south, we never, like, I may have gotten attacked by a smallmouth once, maybe, or a Florida largemouth. So kind of the thinking behind that, or the theory, the working theory is that, so up north they have a very short season that they can spawn in. So that might mean that they're primed to, like, this is my only attempt at a nest, so I've got to defend the heck out of it. Whereas down south we have a longer growing season, and we did see some of those fish re-nest. So, that maybe they're like, I can swim away and maybe abandon this nest, and I can give it another go. I have enough time. And then the other thing is too, down south we have gators, and so there might be if a bass wants to defend its nest real strong, up north where you don't have gators, that might be fine, but down south where you have gators, that just gets you eaten, and then you don't have a successful nest regardless.
Yeah, can't give it another go around if you're not there.
That's true.
I wonder if there's maybe down south there's just less. I know there's brim and tilapia, but less like predatory creatures that would actually feed on the eggs, and so if there's less, the bass aren't as concerned. Whereas, a smallmouth at Lake Erie, it's got to fend off gobies, crawfish, perch, all of these, more bottom-dwelling creatures. What do you think on that, Zach?
Yeah, so one of those studies did look at like the prevalence of nest predators across different lakes, and I'm trying to think of what the results from that were. I know that they did see stronger predation if they took the bass off of the nest, which you'd expect. And then if you have higher nest abandonment rates if you have the nest, a lot of the eggs in the nest eaten. But that does make a lot of sense. I mean, down there, the main nest predator would be bluegill, whereas they don't have round gobies in Florida, to my knowledge. So that would make sense.
Yeah, I think that makes sense to me.
Yes.
Yes.
I'm a scientist.
Yeah. So one thing when it comes when it comes to nesting, too, I know that females will spawn with several males at times. You know, they do that to like ensure the success of their eggs.
Yeah.
But you know, kind of like what you were saying, will a male bass spawn with several females like down south and during that longer period? Do you know if a male bass will spawn with several different females?
Certainly could if it had time. Yeah, I think it would. I don't know that we could exactly track that in the study that we did, but we know that there, based on the number of nests and the population estimates, that there were re-nesting attempts. And it would just be a little bit more difficult for the males because they have a lot more time invested in, you know, actually guarding the nest, as the females can kind of, you know, just say, oh, here's your nest, I'll drop my eggs, and then I'm gone. So a little bit easier for her to do that a few times versus the males where they're, you know, down there in Florida, they're investing, you know, like 7 to 10 days normally in guarding their nests.
Oh, really? That's not that long. I mean, for a long spawning period, 7 to 10 days. We both are friends with Jeremy Reese, who I know has helped you with a more recent study that you guys are currently conducting. Is that correct? That you're looking into a study right now, or doing a study right now?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So Jeremy was a big help. So the study that we've already been talking about with the tournament displacement and then the main lake long distance movements, I mentioned that being a pilot study, and that was kind of like the proof of concept. So like we can tag these fish, they'll survive the tagging process, and then we can track them out of the existing main lake array.
Mm-hmm.
So we used that evidence to write up a proposal for that got funded through Ohio Sea Grant.
Okay.
And that grant is for it'll be a total of 180 tags over 2 years to get at more of the questions that we have. So we already have, you know, we know that some fish can make long distance movements, but we don't know how natural those are because when a fish is caught in a tournament and then moved, you know, tens of miles, we know from scientific literature that tends to make them move more. You know, that once you move them, they're going to start moving and trying to figure out how to get back or whatever. So the new work that we're doing, so we tagged 60 smallmouth in Lake Erie this past spring, and then we'll do another 120 or so in 2024. And so what we're going to do is we're going to be able to look at the natural movements of those fish, you know, because we're catching them and then tagging them and releasing them right away. And then we're also comparing fish that were caught via angling versus electrofishing. So the thought being, so we know from previous scientific studies that fish that will bite on a lure, you know, there's not all bass will bite on a lure. Some of them are a little bit more timid, like we're talking about personality types. Mm-hmm. Some bass are more timid than others, and if they see a lure, they're just, you know, they're freaked out by it. It has to be a way more subtle of a presentation or something like that. So those, and then there's also high vulnerability fish that are, you know, as soon as they see a lure, they're just aggressively attacking it right away. Previous literature has shown that those high vulnerability fish have higher metabolisms and are more successful in raising their nests to success. They're more tenacious in defending their nests. So there are like physiological traits or like things about those individual fish that go along with vulnerability to angling. So for this study, we're actually splitting the capture methods. With Jeremy, he helped us go out and catch fish hook and line and tag them right off of his boat and release them. And then we're also we also are doing electrofishing, where those fish we're not putting that selective pressure of like they have to see a lure and bite on it. We're just shocking the water and tagging all the fish that we can get. So we're considering those to be like more of a control group, or like we're not selecting them via based on their vulnerability. Mm-hmm. So we're going to be able to compare the movement rates between those two groups. You know, whether the And we're thinking, those high vulnerability fish with higher metabolisms may be the fish that also make the long distance movements. And those fish that aren't highly vulnerable may be the fish that just hang out in the same general area for their whole lives.
So when you did that, did you catch fish, rod and reel, and shock fish in the pretty much the same area, or would you just pull up to an area, catch a few over here, then maybe go to a different area and shock that area?
So far it's been somewhat different areas. Well, in fact, it's been completely different areas. But next year, when we're doing a lot more tagging, we're going to go back to similar areas. Now, we're kind of limited with the electrofishing because the shocking from the shock boat only goes down to like 9 feet or something like that. So with Jeremy, we were catching fish in 15 to 20 foot of water or something like that. We can't even shock that far down. So we're kind of limited in the depth of the water that we can go, but we are tagging in general areas. So we're trying to split it up. So it's a total of 180 tags. We're trying to split it into 3 groups, each group in a different area. So one group in the Bass Islands, one group around Kelly's Island, and then one group over in Fairport Harbor area. So more like Central Basin where there's no islands, it's deeper and stuff like that. And then trying to split it about 50-50, where some of those fish are electrofish, some of them are hook and line tagged. And hopefully we're going to be able to compare those two so they're not exactly the same areas, but within a few miles of each other. So hopefully we're getting at the same subpopulations or same groups of fish. And we're doing this during the spawning time too, where they should be segregating into going back to the same areas. So we'll also be able to hopefully look at do these fish spread out? Do they disperse into other areas of the lake? And then do they return to that same spawning area?
Are you able to track the age class of the fish as well? Is a smaller fish more likely to stick around until it grows big enough to where it can go out, swim pelagically, follow bait fish around? Does that make any sense?
Yeah, and we are trying to get at we're tagging a variety of sizes for sure. Okay. Anything from down to I think the smallest one we tagged is something like 13 inches. You can't go much below that because then it's the tag itself, which it's like the size and shape and weight of a AA battery. But the smaller the fish gets, the bigger proportion of the weight that transmitter is. Mm-hmm. So we don't want to put the transmitter into a year-old fish because it's going to be 15% of the body weight, and that's probably going to affect how much it moves. We'd see probably higher mortality and stuff like that. So there is a lower limit around 13, 14 inches that we wouldn't tag below, but we're tagging those 14-inch fish on up to, we tagged a few 20-inch fish. So it's some 4 and 5 pounders as well.
Those must have been electrofish. There's no way Jeremy's catching those.
Yeah. He probably had all the 5-pounders.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Now at the end of this study, of this podcast, Zach, we are gonna need those waypoints.
I'll show you them on a general map in 2 years.
Yeah, perfect. 2 years.
And that, I guess I should mention too, that is a little bit of a frustrating thing about these studies. So the work that's been completed started in 2018. So, a few years later, we have all the data from those tags. Those tags are all done now. The work that we're doing now, I have to wait for the fish to be out there for a few years. And then the receivers actually have to be physically downloaded. So we actually have to snag them off the lake bottom or get them off the lake bottom somehow, download them onto a computer, and then put them back out. So there is a lag time of I won't have results for I'll have initial results maybe at the end of this year, but this study is going to be I won't have full results for another 4 years or something like that.
Wow.
Oh my god.
Does it just falls off the fish then, or does it stay permanently in the fish?
It will stay in the fish hopefully, because we're literally doing surgeries on these fish. So we have a surgery board, so we keep the gills irrigated with water so that we don't kill the fish, and then I'm cutting open with a scalpel the belly of the fish, putting the tag or the transmitter in there, and then actually taking like surgery tools and stitching the fish back up.
Holy
So
smokes.
if I do that right, the fish the sutures are dissolvable, so they'll go away. And if I do it right, the fish will heal up, and the transmitter will just be inside that fish for the rest of the fish's life. It's just that the batteries inside the transmitters will be dead in 2.5, 3 years, something like that.
Okay.
So and then he was talking about the receivers that are on the bottom of the lake. He has to grab those in order to get the data.
Okay.
Yeah, which is interesting.
That's got to be a task, because you said there were only like 2-liter bottle. So, wow.
Yeah. So there's a couple different ways we do that. There's the way that we do it in the shallower areas of the lake, like the western basin where the max water depth is like 30 feet or so. We actually put them on what we call snag lines. So the receiver will be on a concrete anchor with a PVC pipe that we can like bolt the receiver into. And then that will be attached via a line or a steel cable to another anchor so they'll be about 100 feet apart. And then we have waypoints on both of those anchors. And we actually have a big grappling hook that's like 3 foot wide. And so when we want to go take those receivers out, we just go stick this, we drive between the waypoints, throw the grappling hook out, and then hopefully we snag that line, and then we can pull it on board and download it.
And then do you replace it in the same area?
Yeah, the receiver would go, we'd actually, a lot of times we just switch it out with one that has a fresh battery, because the receivers have batteries in them too, so we have to switch out the battery, download the data, and then we'll redeploy a lot of times right away. And then the other way we do it is some of the anchors actually have a special like release mechanism where you can send an ultrasonic signal, so it listens for the signal, and you can send a code to it, and it will actually pop off. And then the receiver has floats on it, and it'll float to the surface, so you can just go grab it, download it, and then redeploy it with a new anchor.
Wow, that's wild.
Yeah.
That is so wild.
That's fun. That sounds like fun. Get the fish for 6 weeks and get paid for it. That's more than a lot of bass fisher tournament fishermen probably get. You know,
that's true.
And scuba and snorkel with the gators.
Yeah, I don't know about that one.
Yeah.
But you get to go bob around in Lake Erie and throw giant grappling hooks around.
Yeah.
I mean, it's got to be a fun job.
Yeah, it absolutely is. I'm very fortunate in that I discovered what fisheries science was when I was early on in my career, and very fortunate to have worked a bunch of cool jobs and had a lot of fun while learning a lot and getting to do some cool stuff out in the lake.
I had one more question about the study that you're currently doing. I think I saw some pictures just off of your Facebook page where you guys were kind of like up some streams. Were those with this study as well? Like, do you see a large portion of smallmouth actually go up into any streams or anything like that off of Lake Erie to spawn, or do they spawn more main lake?
Yeah, that's a great question, Tyler. So in addition to this Ohio Sea Grant study that I have been talking about, there's also another bass tracking study that's funded from the Great Lakes Fishery Commission, and it's actually led by researchers in Green Bay with Wisconsin DNR. So they're doing a bunch of tagging in Green Bay, but my portion of this project was to tag tributary fish. So fish that are smallmouth bass that are in some of the Lake Erie tributaries in the springtime, where we have especially in the central basin and the eastern basin of Lake Erie, where we don't have as much rocky habitat, there is a segment of the population of the lake fish that will actually run up into the tributaries to spawn, and then they'll go back out. So this is just like, salmon and trout like to swim upstream to spawn, and then they go back out. There's a segment of the smallmouth population that does that in some of the Lake Erie tributaries. So this project is looking at, how much do those, what we think are lake runners or tributary spawning fish, what proportion of those fish actually go back out in the main lake? How much do they mingle around with the lake resident population? and do they return to the same tributaries to spawn, that kind of thing. So we did get to do those. Are also some electrofished and some angle or hook and line tagged, but we ended up tagging 30 fish in Conneaut Creek over on the far eastern end of Ohio, and then 30 fish in the Grand River. So we're hoping to look at timing of those seasonal movements, how much they're mingling with the main lake population, and then especially with the Grand River fish, we're tagging some in the river there, and then at the river mouth, that's Fairport Harbor, we tagged fish right there in the harbor too. So hopefully we'll get to compare and contrast some of those, the spawning movements between I don't know for sure if those are river residents or lake runners. We're just going to have to find out. We have no way of knowing until we get the data in. So.
Yeah. So another additional question on that is how far up those tributaries? Obviously, you said in some of the harbors right there, you tagged some. Were you like a mile from the mouth of that tributary, or how far did you guys tag some of these fish?
So we did try and spread them out. So some of them were none of them were like a mile in, but the tributary fish were anywhere from like 2 to 3 miles upriver to some of them were about 15 miles upriver.
Okay.
And we've actually already seen. I had one. So the only data that I have right now are from anglers reporting these captures. So all these fish have that external loop tag. So I get part of my job right now is handling recap reports. I mean, I've literally got a stack of papers on my desk of people who have called in and said, "Hey, I caught this tagged fish. So this fish number 2323 was caught here at this date and time."
Because these are all jaw-lipped fish, or whatever the tag is called, right? They're not transmitters.
Yeah, these are. So they have both. So they have they all have transmitters, but then they have we call them loop tags. So these are fluorescent orange. They're pretty obvious, and they're tagged like under the second dorsal. So they're on the back of the fish towards the tail. But they have my office phone number, and then they have a unique identifying tag number. So if someone calls in this tag, I can actually look and see, when did we tag this fish? And a lot, I try and tell the angler if, where we tag this fish, what it's been up to, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
We have already seen one of those fish that was tagged downstream. We tagged it March 22nd, only about 3 miles upstream in the Grand River. That fish was actually recaptured about a month later, right at Harpersfield Dam, which is the furthest upstream it can go. And I don't, off the top of my head, Harpersfield is probably 25 river miles upstream.
Wow.
That's got to be so cool to answer the phone and have an angler on the line saying, "Hey, I caught one of your fish."
Yeah.
Like that's got to be so rewarding. And even going out and snagging the receivers out of the main basin, I mean, that's got to be like Christmas Day for you.
Yeah, it absolutely is. Getting the data in, and then I have to, when I first get it in, it's just in an Excel document, so it's just a bunch of detections, and then I have to run it through some code to actually connect those detections together and actually make a map of where the fish went. But it's absolutely like Christmas Day. And the angler recaps those reports are awesome, because that's right now that's the only reason I know where my fish went, and even if they survived. Like some of it is like, you can be pretty anxious about putting these tags cost about $300 a piece, and when you just put them in a bunch of fish and send them out there, like I hope most of these fish survive.
Yeah.
But talking to the anglers is great, because it can confirm that the fish is happy and doing well. We get to see where it goes, and then also it's also an opportunity to talk about the fishery and the project with the folks that care the most. Most of the time the anglers are the ones that care the most about conserving the fishery and learning about fish behavior, not only so that they can catch the fish better, but also so that we can have sustainable fisheries, and we can have a Lake Erie smallmouth bass fishery that that is great for years to come.
Unreal. Did you have any part of I think it was like a 10-pound smallmouth that was caught last year? Did you have any part of, looking over that fish? Or I think they did an autopsy on it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I did all that actually.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah, so Grant and Greg, it was amazing. I mean, it's definitely a top 10 highlight of my career. Certainly, I had never seen a 6-pound smallmouth, let alone a 10-pound smallmouth. Grant and Greg Gallagher showed up and had this huge fish, which the pictures that you see online really don't do it justice, because it's just like you're just not used to seeing a 24-inch smallmouth that weighs 10 pounds. It's just like it almost seemed like a different species or something like that. But it was very clearly a smallmouth bass. Like that was my so. My role in that was for the Ontario record. They have to have a biologist sign off on the species identification. So that was my role in certifying the record, which, I mean, honestly, anybody could have done, any angler. Like, it was obviously a smallmouth bass. It was just a gigantic one.
Mm-hmm.
And then we did. So part of the Ontario record certification process is that the fish more or less has to be sacrificed, or it has to be killed, which to Greg's credit, he did not necessarily want to do, and that's an antiquated way of record keeping, and I think we should probably not be doing that, but that's the way it is right now. So knowing that, we tried to learn as much as we could from this fish. So after we did the certification process, we did send it off to get made into a mount or to get molded, and then I actually got the fish's carcass back and was able to do like a fish workup or an autopsy kind of. So I which is pretty typical for us, in order to get information on fish growth and diet information and that kind of thing. We do a fair amount of these autopsies where we're cutting open the fish, and then we can look at the sex of the fish, the maturity of the fish, the whatever diet it's been eating, and then we can also we can age the fish via otoliths or fish ear bones. So we actually have to cut into the skull in a very precise way. And crack open the skull, and if you do it right, you can pull out these tiny little fragile ear bones that are they're probably the size of like your pinky fingernail on a bigger bass. And these are important because the way we can tell age is it's just like a tree grows rings. So you can section a tree and you can count the rings and say this tree was 20 years old or something like that. The reason that happens is because of between summertime and wintertime, there's growth differential. So in the summertime, the tree is growing real fast, and then in the wintertime, the growth slows down because of the cold temperatures, and then it lays down a ring. So every ring represents one winter that the tree went through. A fish does the same thing. So growth slows down in the wintertime, it lays down a ring, and then in the summertime, growth speeds up because of the temperature. And that's the space in between rings. So if we pull out these ear bones, you can see the rings pretty readily under like 10x magnification or something. So for that fish, we determined that it was a 16-year-old male based on the autopsy that we did.
Oh, it was a male.
Male.
Wow.
Was
a male? Yes.
I mean, that's got to be abnormal in itself, but was there any other abnormality to it? Like, why was this fish that big? And are there other giant smallmouth like that swimming in Lake Erie?
So I don't know why it got that big. That has been a question in my mind as well, and I'm super curious about that. But there wasn't anything out of the ordinary except for it was a gigantic fish. There probably are more big fish like it out there. We don't see them as much in our surveys, like our smallmouth bass gillnet survey. We typically only catch some pretty fat fish, but they're only like up to 5 pounds or something like that. We do not see 6-7 pound fish even commonly on this side of the lake. Those are much more common, like 6 and 7 pound fish are more common in New York waters. But the Ontario record, Greg's fish was, I don't know, fairly abnormal in just the size and the fact that it was out here in the Western Basin. And I don't know, he caught that in the fall, so I'm not sure if that fish was just passing through, trying to make it to an overwintering spot. And this fish probably was not caught in a normal, like, typical tournament destination. It's probably a fish that has kind of more of a unique area that it likes to hang out in. That's not an area that people typically go. It's like this fish was not hanging out around the Bass Islands where there's a ton of angling pressure. And that's more or less my best guess.
Yeah, and that's the reason why it got so big. It was 16 years old. It had its own unique personality of, I'm going to stay away from all this stuff. And he probably had to have found some sort of a unique food source, whether it be jumbo perch or, just something a little bit different that maybe kept him out of the way, out of angling pressure.
Yeah. I was going to ask you, I know you said that there wasn't like really any other abnormalities of it, but you said that you were able to like kind of see what he was eating. I mean, was it gobies? Was it perch? Was it crawfish? Or
so we looked at stomach contents, but I didn't see anything identifiable in there. Okay. So that more or less we called it an empty stomach. But I can tell you from our gillnet survey that we've been doing since 2006, gobies make up anywhere from 70 to 90% of smallmouth diets in the Western Basin of Lake Erie. Wow. We very rarely see anything else. I mean, we don't see many crawfish or like occasional gizzard shad or something like that, but it's almost exclusively gobies.
That is crazy how they have just all these northern lakes that have them, how the smallmouth has changed so much. I mean, like the Oneidas, all the lake, the big lakes that have, I mean, these fish have gone from, I think, like a 3 pound average to now it's like you see so many 4s and 5s and 6s.
Oh, yeah. And it's got to correlate to the other species in the lakes. I would assume. Think of smallmouth went from feeding on shiners, gizzard shad, all of that to gobies. Now there's more gizzard shad and shiners for walleye to eat and for perch to eat. So have you noticed, I don't know if there's been a study, but on average, the smallmouth are getting larger eating gobies. Are the other predatory fish in the lake also getting larger because they have more of a food source?
That's a good question. I don't know. So there are definite papers from like the New York side of Lake Erie that have shown that smallmouth bass growth has increased with the invasion of the gobies. I don't know of any papers that have shown that for other species, but we do see like walleye and lake trout in Lake Erie do eat gobies when they can. And it might be more of like if the forage base is lower than it normally is for both of those fish like to eat like smelt in central and eastern basins of Lake Erie. But in years where smelt is low, we see a higher proportion of gobies in the diet. So gobies are like, adding variety to it, or like if they're not able to catch a bunch of smelt, then there's always gobies to go to, even if it's not their preferred prey.
So much of what we talk about when it comes to bass fishing is really just opinions. They are things that we have learned from experiences out there on the water, and that is why I love to get on a biologist like Zach, who has studied bass and really has some concrete evidence in fact. So if you guys enjoy this video, please don't forget to give it a thumbs up. Also, if you want to listen to another Bass Juice podcast, our first one that we did right here with Hunter Shryock is really good. We talked all about whopper plopper and tournament fishing. So please don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next video.